Good morning, everyone. I'm Karen Brewer, and I'm the curator in charge of the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Arts, the museum's department of prints, drawings, photographs, and artist illustrated books. And I'm pleased to introduce our lecturer today. The lecture today is made possible by the Achenbach Graphic Arts Council, a member group that supports the efforts of the department. I thank the council and its members, many of whom are here today. One of the council's many efforts was to raise funds to digitally preserve Arnold Genthe's 1906 earthquake negatives, cellulose nitrate negatives acquired by the Legion of Honor in 1943 that were rapidly deteriorating. Their successful 2014 campaign provided funds to pay for the effort to digitally scan the negatives. And when it became clear that the digital scans contained imagery not previously known, a decision was made in 2017 to print them as gelatin silver prints. That decision was made by our speaker today, Jim Ganz. Jim was a curator for 12 years at the Sterling and Francine Clark Institute in Williams, Massachusetts, when he came to the Achenbach in 2008. He was a curator with us for a decade, from 2008 to 2018. During his tenure, he made important acquisitions and curated outstanding exhibitions. Rembrandt Century, Impressionist Paris, City of Light, Jewel City, Art of the 1915 Panama-Pacific Exposition, and Arthur Tress, San Francisco, 1964. Many of those exhibitions included substantial texts on photography, so it is perhaps not surprising that in 2018, Jim left us for the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles, where he is currently senior curator of photographs and department head. One of the last projects Jim worked on before his departure was research on the San Francisco earthquake, most notably Arnold Genthe's photographs. He was a major contributor to our publication, Among the Ruins, with an essay titled Retracing Genthe's Journey Step by Step. He's going to elaborate on that today and perhaps surprise us with some new discoveries. So please join me in welcoming Jim Ganz.
Wow, it is, I just have to tell you, it is a complete pleasure and delight to be back home. And it really still feels like home to me. It's just, I had an amazing time here. I was thinking about somebody that some of you may remember from years ago, Charlie Moffett. He was a curator of paintings here back in I think the 1980s, and then he went on to other places, and he was at Sotheby's later in his career. And when I got the job in San Francisco in 2008, Charlie was the first person to call me, and he said to me, Jim, it's heaven on earth. And he, I think about that a lot, and he was right. It really is. And so thank you so much for having me. And, you know, I want to thank Sylvia Vantulis for helping coordinate all of this, obviously Karen for inviting me. There's so many people in this room who were involved in this particular project with us. Of course, Victoria Binder, our great conservator who's here. Larry Banka was an incredible contributor as a volunteer to this whole effort to figure out, to sort of solve many of the mysteries. Tim Brown is also here, one of our great volunteers in the department. I don't think he's in the auditorium, but I saw Bruce Chin this morning. He's an engineer with the museum who helped out with some of the technological stuff, and Randy Dodson, the photographer who works for the museums. Deborah Evans, who really introduced me to the collection of Genthe negatives even before I was ready in my brain to even think about it. She alerted me to this collection probably within a few weeks of starting here. And I wish I had listened to her then, because it took some time to get onto it. But there were so many wonderful people at the museums who were involved in this, and Leslie Dutcher, the head of publications, Vicki Gannon, one of the great editors over at the DeYoung. So really, it was the whole thing was really quite a pleasure for me, and it really is a pleasure to revisit this and to come back and talk about it with you. So I will basically tell you what my plan is this morning, and it's the first part of the talk. I'm going to give you a quick review of how we got here with the Genthe collection and the negatives and all of that. Karen just reviewed a bit of it. And then I'm going to focus on just a few of the areas that the Genthe photographed on the day of the earthquake. And I'm not going to show all of them, but it's all in the book, so you can, there's much more there. I knew somebody was going to say that. Rich, I predicted it. Okay. Can you hear me now? It's not a talk until somebody says, you're not talking loud enough. All right. So, now I know what you're thinking. Was Robert Flynn Johnson a time traveler? Because that is actually a self-portrait of Arnold Genthe in the Library of Congress. So Genthe was German. He arrived in San Francisco in 1895 when he was 26 years old as a tutor for a German family. And he really kind of quickly established himself here. He loved San Francisco. He took up photography as an amateur. He published some photographs in The Wave. And by 1899, he was actually working as a professional photographer. So he was a society portraitist. And this was one of the ways that he sort of connected with people. He was really quite a man about town. He was an equestrian. This is Genthe on his famous horse. The horse is called Chesty, which is kind of a weird name for a horse. And this picture was taken, there's the old Cliff House, supposedly in around 1906. So it would have been, in the early months of 1906 or perhaps late 1905 before the earthquake. And Genthe is probably best known for two bodies of work: his photographs of old Chinatown that he took before the earthquake and then published after the quake, after Chinatown had been basically destroyed, and his photographs of the scene after the earthquake and fire. Now, even though he's pretty well known for that body of work, he only printed relatively few of them. I think we figured out there were really only maybe a couple of dozen out of the, say, 170 or so negatives that he actually ever printed at all. There were certain images he liked and printed, but there aren't a lot of vintage prints. So what there are a handful of vintage prints, a stock book that he kept with little contact prints that's at the Library of Congress, that's of all of his photographs. And then, of course, the negatives, the nitrate negatives. So in 1942-43, this is a telegram, you can read it. It's actually from Tommy Carr Howe, sorry, to the executor of Genthe's estate back in New York. They had found all of this stuff, and there was some sort of connection between the executor and Howe, and a discussion of the fact that, this material really belongs in San Francisco. It's an odd thing for the museum to acquire, I must say, to acquire a whole bunch of nitrate negatives. And the negatives, when they bought them, they didn't really consider that part of the art collection. It was a kind of archive. They actually used those negatives to produce new prints, which they would send out to newspapers and whoever else. But they also, as you can see, they got some images of Chinatown as well. So they actually, it was kind of an amazing deal. $300 basically for the whole kit and caboodle. So for a number of years, the negatives were, as I say, used to make prints, and the staff photographer, Hy Hirsch, was one of the people that printed from the negatives early on. And they used that to produce some prints that they exhibited. I think Karen actually writes about this in her essay in the catalog. It kind of tells the history that I'm just covering very superficially here. For the 50th anniversary, they hired Ansel Adams to print 22 of the negatives and had another small exhibition at the Legion of Honor. He actually made 3 sets of those prints, one set for the Legion of Honor, one set is at George Eastman House, and one for the Art Institute of Chicago. Okay, so then jumping pretty far ahead, you all, I hope, recognize Debbie Evans, my former dear colleague from the Legion. The 2010 rehousing project was a big deal. The negatives, cellulose nitrate negatives decompose, and when they decompose, they emit harmful gases, including nitric acid, so they eventually destroy themselves, and there's really nothing you can do to stop that from happening, but you can slow the process down if you store them properly, and they need to be refrigerated. So in 2010, this has been basically, I guess, 2 years after I was here, Debbie was able to redo the housing and put them in the freezer, just to kind of keep things from getting worse. But we started talking about what we could do next. And so in 2011, we received a donation from Lucy Hamilton to hire a private conservator. This was Tim Vitale, to do some tests, test scans from the negatives to kind of give us a sense of what we could get out of these negatives that actually looked pretty bad. And you can see just how hard it is to even see the images on these negatives. So Tim did some test scans. He did some cleanup of the imagery, and it was pretty amazing. I mean, I think we all realized at that time that this was something that needed to be done. But it's very specialized work, and it has to be done by someone who's trained to work with these kinds of materials that are, after all, they're flammable and kind of hard to deal with in so many ways. So it took a couple of years, and then there we are, there we are with good old Carl Nolte. Helped us out by running this story. And we raised some more money. And again, it was the AGAC that really made this happen. It was an amazing success. And basically, you can see, it said we needed $40,000 to preserve this photographer's peerless images of the quake. And we got that and more. We got enough to make this all happen. So the negatives were sent off to the Berkshires, my previous home, South Berkshire County. Housatonic, Massachusetts is where Chicago Albumin Works is. Not in Chicago. It was founded in Chicago, but they moved to the Berkshires and never changed their name. And they made all of the scans of the negatives. They scanned each negative once, and then they produced a whole bunch of different derivatives from the scan. But basically, each negative image is a 2 gigabyte TIFF. So that's an enormous file. I mean, that's enough to probably crash your computer if you tried to open it. And then they were able to produce all kinds of images from that that could be used for printing, and they actually produced a full set of inkjet prints for us of all of the negatives, just as a kind of study collection. The resolution of the negatives is somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 pixels per inch, and as Karen said, that really brought out a lot of information that was there that was not necessarily visible before. And of course, many of these negatives had never really been printed. As I say, there were really only a relative handful that were well known, and then there was a large body of them that basically, Genthe himself had never printed. So the next step was to commission Barrett Oliver, who is a very talented photographer, printer, publisher, photo historian. He specializes in historic processes. He wrote a whole book on the Woodbury type. And in Glendora, down outside of LA, he created digital negatives from those scans and contact printed them as gelatin silver prints, producing prints to our very precise specifications. And there was a lot of back and forth with Barrett about the print tonality, the kind of paper, the overall approach to it. Victoria will remember how he would produce test prints and send them to us, and we would look at them, and there would be some little thing that was off. And Barrett is a perfectionist, and I always felt bad that we had to keep asking him to try again, but he was always willing to do it because he wanted it to be right. I thought it would be interesting just to show how the Ansel Adams prints compare to Barrett's. One of the decisions we made was to open up and scan the full negative, so include all of the marginal stuff, which sometimes is interesting. Sometimes there's information there that's useful. And then finally, last but not least, the book came out. So, I left the Achenbach in 2018, as Karen said, and I'm so grateful that my colleagues here made sure that this project did not die after I left. So the result is this beautiful book that they produced and that came out last year. And it is the first publication on the subject of Genthe's earthquake negatives. There was a wonderful woman named Toby Quitzland who wrote a dissertation on Genthe's years in San Francisco back in 1988, and it included a chapter on the earthquake. And Toby was somebody that we always had a copy of her dissertation in the Achenbach. She was this kind of legendary Quitzland, like we always have to look in Quitzland. And I was able to reach out to her and actually talk to her a few times. Sadly, she passed away in 2017. Didn't get to see this through, but she was really generous with her research, and her husband also provided us with some notes and materials that she left. But our book encapsulates years of new research on the photographs, which involved a lot of different sources. So besides the photographs, which exist in the form of the cellulose nitrate negatives and some of those early prints, there's an autobiography he wrote 30 years after the earthquake, 1936, called As I Remember, which is an important source, although 30 years went by and he forgot some things, I think. But we also relied on contemporary firsthand accounts, newspaper articles, official reports, and photographs of the disaster, detailed maps and directories relating to the city and its inhabitants, such as the Hicks Judd Company's San Francisco Block Book, which came out in January 1906, which records owners of real estate, the San Francisco Sanborn Insurance Map Atlas of September 1905, really good timing on that one, which preserves detailed information concerning the existing buildings at the time of the earthquake, and also the most recent Crocker-Langley directory of May 1905. And there are some also good secondary sources, but really this is an important book because this material, this important body of work, has never been fully published before. So let's see. So if you read Genthe's autobiography, as I say, there's a chapter on the earthquake, and we reproduced that chapter in our catalog, so it's all there, and you can read through it. And it, he basically describes his day. The earthquake strikes. It's 5:13 a.m. He's awakened from his sleep. He gets himself dressed, and he walks out to Van Ness to visit his friends Milton and Mabel Bremer. You can see where they lived. And they all got together and sort of looked at each other and decided, well, we're okay, let's go get some breakfast. So they walked over to the St. Francis Hotel, which was open. I think the power was out, but they were serving food, and I think people were in relatively good spirits because they had survived the earthquake. But there was also awareness that, in fact, there was some damage in other parts of the city that was perhaps more extensive, and fires were starting to burn. So after breakfast, Genthe went back home to his studio, at his home and studio on Sutter Street, basically to get a camera, and that's when he realized that basically all of his cameras were destroyed. They were all broken. So he then set out to visit his camera shop, the shop of George Kahn, and that was located in the financial district. So Kahn, the story goes, he goes to see Kahn, he's in his store, Kahn says, take whatever you want, this place is going to burn down soon anyway. So he gets a Kodak 3A camera, he fills his pockets with film, and he starts photographing. And naturally, the first photographs he takes are right in the neighborhood. So, all of this was predicted. It was all predicted in a publication called The Insurance Press in 1905. And you can see a quote from this publication. It was published in New York, and it basically said that not only is the hazard extreme within the congested value district, but it is augmented by the presence of a residential district, itself unmanageable from a firefighting standpoint by reason of adverse conditions introduced by the topography. In fact, San Francisco has violated all underwriting traditions and precedent by not burning up. So, it wasn't a surprise when, in fact, fires started to burn. Ironically, the downtown area where the fire insurance offices were concentrated was practically the first area to burn. And these offices were chock full of paper files, and I'm sure many, many copies of the Insurance Press, which served as kindling for the fire. It's estimated that $250 million in claims were paid by American and European insurance companies in the wake of the disaster, and that's 1906 dollars. That's a lot of money. So just around the corner from George Kahn's camera shop, literally around the corner, he comes upon this scene at the northeast corner of California and Sansom Street, which was fully engulfed in flames. And this is one of two photographs he took in rapid succession of this building burning. And you can see from the title on this slide, this is sort of typical of what we were facing here in the collection, which is we didn't really know most of the locations. So this was described as fire engines near burning buildings. And that's all we had on it. And, in hindsight, everything is so obvious, but literally, we had to figure all of this stuff out using all of the sources that I just mentioned. So this building was called the Friedlander Block. It was named for Isaac Friedlander, a German expatriate wheat broker known as the Grain King of San Francisco. And you can see here is a Carlton Watkins photograph of it when it was newly built. And it's always fun to read about these buildings, which are all described inevitably as being earthquake-proof. So there it is. Now, you can see in this sort of image to situate you, this is the block. So the camera is where Genthe is standing, right? The Friedlander Block is the burning building we just looked at. Across from it is the Mutual Life Building and the Fireman's Fund. And on this corner, it was an excavated lot. You can see the Bank of California building was going to go there. And I love these photographs. There's a series of amazing images of the earthquake by Edith Irvine, who was a photographer from Calaveras County, and just by pure fluke, she happened to be in San Francisco at the time of the earthquake, and she had her camera with her, and she was using larger negatives, glass plate negatives, so her photographs are super sharp. She never printed any of them. The collection all ended up at Brigham Young, which fortunately scanned them some time ago and provided images on their website. So you can see all of her stuff online. And what I love is that she actually she plunked herself down in the excavated lot. And so there's the Friedlander building, just the corner of it, Mutual Life Fireman's Fund. And she captured something that nobody else did, which is all of these piles of files, ledger books that had been removed from various offices by people who were running around all morning, and they dumped them in the middle of this excavated lot so they wouldn't catch on fire, because I think everybody knew what was going to happen next. I love it when I can find a first-hand source, a text that I can match up with an image. So I've got one to share with you. There was an attorney named James Stetson whose office was at 123 California Street, and he needed desperately to get into the office to get his records out of it, right? So he went there early in the morning, and a janitor leaving the building said, "Don't go in there." But he did go in, and this is what he wrote about it. He said, "The sparks were coming down into the open area in a shower, but as there was no smoke in the building, I was sure that it was not on fire. I got up to my room on the 5th floor, but was unable to get into my office as the door would not open. I tried the door in the adjoining office of the Western Beet Sugar Company and found it open. From that room, I got into mine. I raised my shades and saw that the fire was blazing at Battery Street, fully 50 feet high. I looked through the hall and the rooms and saw no smoke and was therefore sure that I was safe for a few minutes. I turned the combination to my safe and opened it." So he grabbed his records and then he made a hasty exit. And he says, "The sparks were plentiful in the area when I went up, but they were more so when I came down, a perfect firestorm after the manner of a snowstorm. When I got onto California Street, the air was a mass of sparks and smoke. I was afraid, as I had to go against it to get to Front Street, that my papers would take fire in my arms, so I buttoned up my coat to keep the sparks out from my papers and pulled my hat down over my eyes. In this manner, I virtually dove through it up California Street and over Front Street to Pine." So just think about, they all really needed their files, right? Nothing is in the cloud in 1906, So Edith Irvine, she also photographed the crowds at Montgomery in California looking toward the fire scene. And that's the Friedlander block. You can see off in the distance there. And she was joined at that location by Willard Warden, who is a professional San Francisco photographer. And again, he captured what the fire department was trying to do at that location. And again, I love it when you can match up images with firsthand accounts. So George Brooks, who was an executive with the California Insurance Company, described precisely this scene in his memoir, The Spirit of 1906, which he wrote in 1921. And he says, "I then stood and watched the firemen lower a suction pipe through a manhole in the middle of the street and pump sewage onto the old Wells Fargo building." That's the Friedlander block building. "It had about as much effect as a garden hose, and the supply was soon exhausted. The firemen stood perfectly helpless, like soldiers without ammunition in front of the enemy." And I was able to find more images of the building burning. These are by anonymous photographers, but everybody kind of in the same general area. You get the sense that people were being kept kept back in certain locations, and that's why we see so many of the same kind of images by various different photographers on the day of the earthquake. I think these are particularly great. And then again, finally, Genthe's two views. Now with the building fully engulfed, two views taken one probably right after the other. He often took two views of a certain location, maybe bracketing his exposure or maybe just making sure he got it, perhaps one on one roll and one on the next roll, sometimes a vertical and a horizontal. In this case, two horizontal images. One of them is somewhat shaky. And what's fun is that you can actually take all of these images and you can create almost like a time lapse of the building slowly burning from top to bottom until we get to Genthe's photographs. So you see that the building really was earthquake-proof. It survived the earthquake just fine. It wasn't fireproof. So, sorry. I'm not going to spend too much time in Chinatown, but he eventually moved on to Chinatown, which of course was a part of the city that had long fascinated him since his earliest days in San Francisco. And he took several photographs on Clay Street, looking toward the raging fire scene, toward the waterfront. And you know, one of the things we really tried to do in this project was come up with not only the locations, but the chronology. That's not that simple, even though you have the autobiography, because if you really go through that and look at the images closely, it seems like his memory was a bit faulty 30 years after the fact. So you can't take everything in the autobiography for granted. One of the potential clues to the chronology is the fact that there actually are cast shadows in some of the photographs. Now, most of the photographs don't have cast shadows, either because there was smoke, probably mainly because there was smoke in the sky, or maybe a bit foggy. But you know, the sun pokes through occasionally, and you get a shadow. So we would go out. We did this 2 years in a row, in 2016 and in 2017. We tried to retrace Genthe's steps, and it was a lot of fun because we had breakfast at the St. Francis Hotel, right? We walked out to Sutter Street, you know, to where his studio would have been. We walked to where George Kahn's shop would have been, and we, you know, bit by bit, we covered all of the same ground. And because there are cast shadows in the Clay Street pictures, and that's Victoria on the right, we could figure out exactly what time so this is the precise location on the same day, and we think at the same time, which puts him here it would have been shortly after noon. Now, when we had Pacific Daylight Standard Time, it would have been 1 o'clock. So, and then moving uphill on Clay Street, he took two of the most amazing images. This is on Clay west of Stockton, these groups of people standing next to the Chinese school, the Chinese public school on Clay Street. And Roger Burt has a wonderful essay in the catalog talking about, you know, images of African American victims of the earthquake who were captured by Genthe, people who lived in San Francisco who have been kind of forgotten from the whole story, from the whole record. But this was a very interesting neighborhood, this part of Chinatown. It wasn't really Chinatown, it was sort of north of it or west of it. And I spent a lot of effort studying the famous Sacramento Street photograph. So this is the most famous picture probably by Genthe that he ever made, and certainly his most famous view of the earthquake, taken on Sacramento Street just below Powell, again looking east toward the fire scene. This is at Sacramento Street and Miles Place. And he wrote about this picture in his autobiography. He said, "Of the pictures I had made during the fire, there are several, I believe, that will be of lasting interest. There is particularly the one scene that I recorded the morning of the first day of the fire on Sacramento Street, looking toward the bay, which shows in a pictorially effective composition the results of the earthquake, the beginnings of the fire, and the attitude of the people. It is hard to believe that such a scene actually occurred in the way the photograph represents it. Several people, upon seeing it, have exclaimed, 'Oh, is that a still from a Cecil DeMille picture?' to which the answer has been no, the director of the scene was the Lord himself. So that gets quoted a lot, as you can imagine. And so but I was amazed that as famous as that image is, nobody had ever really seriously interrogated it to figure out what exactly we were seeing in it. So I spent a lot of time studying, again, the block books, the Sanborn map, the city directories, newspapers, in an effort to understand what exactly we were seeing in this photograph. And I can say that nobody rich or famous lived here, really. It was an ordinary block in a neighborhood between the northern end of Chinatown and the southern end of Nob Hill, a street without any real distinction, but to the dozens of San Franciscans of different racial and ethnic backgrounds who lived here, this was the center of their world. I mean, Genthe captured it literally in the hours before it ceased to exist and its occupants were dispersed. So you can see here I've sort of labeled the buildings, and you can look at the list down below to see who lived there, and I tried to find out as much as I possibly could about all of these people. This part of the city was deeply fractured long before the April 18th, 1906 earthquake, and no episode more clearly illustrates the racial disharmony than the school board's spring 1894 resolution to move the Chinese school from Clay Street. That's the place where those folks were posing in the picture I showed you a minute ago. But there was a plan in 1894 to actually move the Chinese school from Clay Street up to a former commercial school building on Powell between Clay and Sacramento Street. And they had actually floated the idea back in 1892, a little bit earlier. And they thought, because the Chinese school was really crowded, they could take advantage of this other building further up the street. But in 1892, the plan was scuttled, and then when they revived it 2 years later, the white residents in this neighborhood were really threatened by this. They felt that Chinatown was encroaching on their neighborhood. And I think it's really telling that the revised plan, included the construction of this crazy 45-foot-long staircase connecting the Clay Street school with the back of the school on Powell Street, so that the Chinese students could basically enter and exit from the old building and they wouldn't actually have to set foot on Powell Street. That's how tortured this all was. But John Thomas Kelly, who lived here, this was his house, and he owned the house that he lived in, and he had rental properties, including the house next door, which was occupied by a French dressmaker. He had a couple of two-family homes on the corner of Sacramento and Powell. Kelly, the guy that lived here, circulated a petition signed by 150 property owners to kill the plan. "There is plenty of room in Chinatown for a Chinese school," he was quoted in the call. "The proposed change would merely extend the limits of Chinatown over our section of the city." He argued that the property values would plummet. He mentioned one of his neighbors who had already moved once to try to get away from the Chinese population who were slowly moving up the hill, and this poor guy was going to have to move a second time. And so it gives you a little bit of sense of how fractured this part of the city really was. So despite the fact that at the time of the earthquake, every building that you see belonged to white people, it was the block's demographic was actually relatively diverse. But the buildings were racially segregated building by building. That was the sort of interesting part. So 22 Prospect Place was the site of the Japanese Presbyterian Mission Home, and there are lots of little help wanted ads from some of the young people that lived in that home at the time looking for work. The next building down, 920 Sacramento Street, which was the second site of the Presbyterian Occidental Mission Home for Girls, which was run by Donaldina Cameron, who was this famous missionary I'm sure you've all heard of, who was from a Scottish family originally from New Zealand, who'd come to San Francisco and had saved many young girls from slavery, in fact. And this is another great example of an opportunity where you have an image, in this case, Genthe's famous photograph, that you can marry with a text. And I just put the text on the screen. You can read it yourself. It's basically, she's describing what it was like that day, the day that Genthe was there photographing Sacramento Street, and how they had to protect the kids who were basically just out in the street. Of course, Cameron House is now named for her, and then moving across, there was an apartment building that was a brand new apartment building that the Golden Gate Company had just put up. And you can see that the windows were filled with "To Let" signs. So I'm not sure anybody was yet living there, but Sage Dealey and Company Real Estate Agency was advertising apartments in this particular building. The building next to it, which is the one that everybody always marvels at because of what happened to it, the brick facade sheared off, revealing the interior and all of the furnishings, the pictures hanging on the wall, the piano, almost like a dollhouse. And a press photographer actually photographed the same building on the same day. He captured a frontal view of it, so you can actually see inside. You can see the wallpaper, and kind of fascinating. That's a building that on the Sanborn fire maps is described as a tenement. And so I spent some time and effort to try to figure out who exactly lived in this building, and it became pretty clear that this was a building that was primarily or perhaps solely occupied by African American residents, including the pastor of the First African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church nearby, although I think he had moved out beforehand. And you can see just from basically the directory, the Crocker-Langley directory, who some of the people were that lived there. There were laundrymen, waiters, bellmen, and a janitor. And then finally, the building on the far right was another apartment building that belonged to Alexander Wilson, who was a Swedish immigrant real estate maven, and that's at 935 Sacramento Street, which was the site of Yamatoya, one of the city's first Japanese restaurants, which opened in the 1890s. And in 1906, it had 16 one-room apartments in it. So that's who lived there, and there you have it. So I'm not going to spend much more time. He made his way up Russian Hill, and he took several photographs on a grassy knoll where people had gathered to watch the city burn. And we were able to compare Genthe's views with others to pinpoint the location, which was close to Vallejo Street. I seem to remember that Larry Banca maybe Larry found this comparative image. We spent a lot of time looking for other photographs that could help us because Genthe's typically had no information, but sometimes other photographs made either before or during the earthquake or shortly after the earthquake will actually tell you what they depict. So, and then this turret visible in a couple of the images you can see is from Our Lady of Guadalupe at Broadway and Mason, a church that, of course, burned, but and there are really very few photographs. This is the only photograph I could find of it at all, and that was quite difficult to locate, as I remember. So this location turns out to be an empty lot on the corner of Taylor and Vallejo Street, and I think it's currently the site of Ina Colberth Park with its amazing sweeping views of the city. We really had fun on this project, and one of my favorite memories was when we went on April 18th, 2017. We went again to follow the steps, but this time we actually had a Kodak 3A camera that I had bought on eBay, and that Bruce Chin and Randy Dodson, between the two of them, had managed to make it actually work although the film wasn't the right kind of film, but it actually worked. So I remember, going to these locations with a 3A camera, and we realized that, nobody had been on this spot with a 3A camera since April 18th, 1906, and here we were on April 18th, 2017, retracing Genthe's steps. The whole story, or a lot more of the story, is in the book, and you can read about all of the other places that Genthe photographed, and in far more detail. And so I encourage you to check that out. And with that, I will thank you for coming this morning. And I can try to answer questions if you have some. I've got to pick my papers up off the floor first. I'm still here. The one thing I remember about this podium is there's really no place to put your spent lecture notes. Anybody have a question? The gas lights? I think the main factor in the fires was there was really no water to fight the fire. There were very few sources of water. So, and this was something that, again, the insurance people, they knew all about this and they had warned San Francisco, but they hadn't taken those precautions. So, now there are, around the city, there are these areas where there's water. So we can hopefully be better prepared. Susan.
Yes. I think I recall in Simon Winchester's book, A Crack at the Edge of the World, that he said that there was a lot of builders ignoring what fire codes there were and threw up buildings helter-skelter without much thought to how they would do in a fire or any other kind of emergency. Could you comment on that, or is that what you also understood?
Oh yeah, you definitely get a sense that, I think nobody could conceive of this happening. It's still, and you walk around San Francisco today and you can't imagine this happening, but it can happen. By the way, that's a great book. When I took the job in San Francisco, one of my friends, the education curator at the Clark, gave me that book, and I was like, wait a minute, do I really want to read this? But it is fascinating, yeah. Any others? Elizabeth.
Was there any consistency in the way that the various people who printed from the negatives manipulated the images? Ansel Adams, Genthe himself?
Yeah, I think, when Barrett printed the photographs, we were trying with Barrett to emulate the vintage prints that existed by Genthe, because there are some vintage prints by Genthe, and they tend to be a little bit more romantic, a little more pictorialist in style, although I think actually some of his later, when he printed from the negatives a little bit later, they were even more that way. Ansel Adams had a very hard-edged style, and his photographs are very crisp, graphic, black and white, edges all squared off and cleaned up. So they're very different. So we definitely, with Barrett, we tried to make them look like, as best as we could, what Genthe's own approach had been to printing them. There are some vintage prints around. There's some at Berkeley and various other places that we tried to look at. Yep. One there, and then Lourdes.
Thank you very much. This has been really interesting. It's just a great story, and you're a great storyteller.
Thank you.
Could you please repeat the name of the book you were just speaking about? You said it's, by the way, it's an interesting...
A Winchester, a Crack at the Edge of the World. Is that the title? I think that's the title.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Winchester. Yeah, it's kind of a classic. I think Lourdes has a question. This image, which I didn't actually put in the talk, this is like, I think it's Taylor and, I actually need to look in the book to remember. But what's interesting about this is that, so this is Russian Hill, I think, near Russian Hill. They actually lived in one of these buildings previously. So we think that the day of the earthquake, I mean, eventually he's trying to go to higher and higher places to get a vista of the burning city, but he's also revisiting areas where he knows people. So he had actually lived in one of these buildings, which is kind of amazing to know that. And one of his friends, who was an artist, was still there. So he might have gone up there to, sort of check on his buddy, but he also knew that he'd have good views. He knew the city pretty well, but he couldn't go everywhere because, there were some areas that were just off limits already. So his experience of the earthquake and the fires, it's very sort of localized to specific sites that he could visit on the day of the earthquake. And then subsequently, of course, he photographed lots of ruins, but even then, there were just certain parts of the city where he could photograph and where he was interested to go, particularly like areas that he, around where he had lived. He didn't make a comprehensive record of the city, and he probably didn't even have a plan in mind of what to do with this stuff. He certainly never, other than, as I say, a couple of dozen prints, he didn't really do that much with these. He never published them, never published a book of them, just kind of kept them. And he returned to, actually it gave him impetus to publish his Chinatown pictures, which fortunately, the negatives for Chinatown were not in his house. He had stored them somewhere else, so they weren't destroyed. And 2 years after the earthquake, he was able to publish a book now of old Chinatown, basically Chinatown as it existed before the earthquake. Then he moved to New York in 1911 and spent the rest of his life there. And he was mainly a society sort of celebrity portrait photographer in New York, quite successful. Didn't really revisit the earthquake until he wrote his memoir and just sort of remembered what happened that day.
Hey, Jim.
Jonathan.
How many negatives are there in this collection, and over how many days was he making these photographs, do you think?
Yeah, I think the grand total is like it's about 167, if I'm not mistaken. There are oh my God, sorry about this. There are a handful of images not represented in the negative collection. That is, there are like half a dozen or 8 images that are in the Library of Congress where we don't have a negative for whatever reason. And he took many of the photographs that I write about and I've focused on today are the pictures made on the day of the earthquake. And then he seems to have done most of the photographs, I would say, in the next couple of weeks. And then over time, there's some evidence. There are some pictures showing people starting to rebuild that could have been done a couple of months later. But it's pretty concentrated in the first couple of weeks, I would say. He was, quoted in the newspaper about just how he was walking around with his camera really kind of stunned, taking it in with his camera, which is what a photographer does. All right, well, thanks for sticking with me. It's great to see you all here. Thank you.